Today's scripture comes from Matthew 5, starting in 13. You are the salt of the earth, but if the salt loses its flavor, how shall it be seasoned? It is then good for nothing but to be thrown out and trampled underfoot by men. You are the light of the world. A city that is set on a hill cannot be hidden, nor do they light a lamp and put it under a basket, but on a lampstand, and it gives light to all who are in the house. Let your light so shine before men that they may see your good works and glorify your Father in heaven.
Again, thanks for the reading. I always appreciate that. Thanks, Nick, and thanks for everyone being here. Clay is taking a well-deserved few days off, and it's his anniversary weekend, and he and Mindy are out of town, and he called me and asked me if I could fill in for him this morning, and I told him yes, and here I am. So maybe that's why we got some missing. I'm not sure, but or maybe they heard Bo was leading singing. I don't know which, or it could be the Landrys, period. Anyway, I'm going to use 13, 14, 15, 16. We're looking at the Sermon on the Mount, and on a Sunday morning class, and we're there now at these verses. So I thought I'd use them at least as a kickoff to the lesson. Today we're going to the Old Testament here in just a few minutes, and look at a few verses about Moses. But these are such tremendous citizen type kingdom verses. And as we've been discussing on our class, the Sermon on the Mount has been said to be many things, but it is a sermon about the kingdom. Christ is talking to his disciples and the disciples of a multitude, and he's up on a mountain doing this, and they're below, and they're able to hear what he says. And I'm sure that you've got to understand that these people are not rich society type people. Those that are following him are poor. Many are sickly. That's one of the reasons why we see the great multitudes following him and going where he goes, because they want to be healed. They like what he's doing and what he's given to people. And a lot of times that's what we see in the world today. We see they follow those who gives a lot, and then they quit following when they don't. And that's where we see John 6, as we discussed in our class. John 6 is where the multitudes came. That he shows a great miracle of feeding them with just a few loaves and fishes, starting out. And then they want to take him and make him king. And he says no. And we begin to see from then on the multitudes leaving him, and disciples being trained to take over. But I want you to notice, and we'll probably have some duplication in our class, but I want you to notice what it says here. He uses individually here, second person, you. Wow, you, he says. Can you see Jesus is speaking out? As he said, blessed are they. You remember in the Beatitudes, it's blessed are they. But here, we see a transition here. We see it in a couple verses before that. But he uses you as a pronoun. He says, you, speaking to you. And that means when somebody says you out there, that's to draw attention that he's talking to you. He's not just talking to me. He's talking to you. He's not just talking to Donnie. He's also talking to Chuck. He's not just talking to Nick. He's talking to Bo. He's talking to everybody that's out there. And he says, notice you are the salt of the earth. Interesting that he says that, because he doesn't say you're the salt of what? Of heaven. That's not what he says. He says, you, and he's talking to those, which is interesting that I just brought up because he's talking to the poor. He's talking to the needy. He's talking to those who don't know where maybe their next meal comes from. He's talking to those who needs a physician. And he says, you are the salt of the earth. And then he has this three-letter word we hear a lot. But. And here it comes. He says, but if the salt has become tasteless, how can it be made salty again? And it can't. So it's sodium chloride, and that doesn't change, except it can be made useless. They would draw salt out of the salt water. They would go in and they wouldn't use the salt necessarily on the ground. They would get the salt water and in the Dead Sea, they would pile it up to use. And when a heavy rain came, some of that salt would harden. And then they would throw it out in the streets to be walked on because it wasn't any good for anything else. And that's why he said it's no longer good for anything. It's set to be thrown out and trampled under the foot of men because that's what it was used for. It just become hard and solid, and they would throw it out to be used as a road or whatever was needed there for hardened material. And so he says, hey, if you draw the salt out, it's great. See, salt was a necessity of life back then. It still is today, even though we hear all the time you're not supposed to have salt, etc. But salt was a necessity. They even paid the Roman soldiers, many of them, by giving them salt. It was a preservative. They would take and get, as the fish was gathered, and they had to transport it all over, they would cure it with salt. That was a necessity. They didn't have refrigerators and that kind of thing back then. Ice wouldn't last. And so salt was something that was necessary. And he says, you are the salt of the earth. Do you realize, I don't know if you do or not, but do you realize that today the church is the reason why Christ hasn't come back yet? Because we are to be the salt of the earth. We are to be the preserved. That's why he says you're the salt of the earth. You're not the salt of heaven. You're not salt of anything, but you're salt of the earth. And if you become hardened, like you've gone on the bank and become hardened because of the rain and because of something of this world, he says you have become useless to me. We kind of see that in Revelation, that he's saying, hey, you got to change or remove you from me because you become useless to me. Laodicea is a good example. We'll cover that someday in our Wednesday night class. But then he goes on to say, you are the light of the world. A city set on a hill cannot be hidden. Now, it was common back then that they would try to build their cities on a high place. And the reason for that is they left the flatter ground and the ground down below where they could graze their cattle, raise their crops, put their vineyards in, that kind of thing. And the hilly place would be a place where at night travelers would be able to see the lanterns. And from miles away, they would be able to see the light, and they would go to the light where they would stay, or where they could be fed, or where they could be sheltered, or whatever necessary. needs they had. And that's why he says, you're the light of the world. No, you're the salt of the earth and you're the light of the world. Again, he doesn't say heaven. He says it's here now. A city that's set on a hill cannot be hidden. That wasn't his purpose. A city was built on a hill so it could be noticed by the travelers, and especially in darkness at night, they could see. Can you imagine driving along in Oklahoma City at midnight, and all of a sudden the electric grid for Oklahoma City, or electric grids for Oklahoma City, shut down? Can you imagine what the city would be like? You'd say, well, I've got my lights on my car. Well, yeah, you do. But just think about that if you didn't have it. Let's just think about you walking on the streets, riding a bicycle. And all of a sudden, all the lights in Oklahoma City go out. You can't see the front of your face. He says, nor does anyone light a lamp and put it under a basket. The reason why people would light a lamp is for light, not to put something over it so it can't be useful. And then he says, put it on a lampstand. As we talked about in one of our parables, Jewish homes were usually one room. There may be a curtain separating some, but it's basically built as one room. And as we talked about, that there would be lined out in that room, there would be some beds made on the floor, usually blankets and that kind of thing. Maybe some down stuff or sheep hair stuff or whatever, wool stuff or whatever. But they would, if they had 5 people, then they would be laid out on the floor. That's why they didn't go, if you remember the lesson, that's why they didn't like for people to knock on the door at night, because it woke everybody up. It's not like it is now, where you have multi-rooms and everybody has a bedroom and stuff. And what they would do is, since it was one room, they all had usually small oil lamps, and it would be lit. Doors would be shut and the windows shut, and they would light this oil lamp, and they would put it on a lampstand. Now, a lampstand could be what we might call a mantle or something hanging down from the ceiling. Sometimes they would make a special stone when they were building that house where you could set the lamp on or hang it on. But anyway, a lampstand, not necessarily what we would look at and think it's a metal thing that you hang it on. It could be that, but it was on something, and it was on something high so that it would expel throughout the room. Everybody could see. Whereas, you know yourself, if you took a lantern and you put it down here, you got a little space, but you hang it up and it spells out. That's what he's trying to get to us and get to these people here. Hey, you're to stand up tall, go out for Christ. You're to be a light that's on a lampstand and expels out. And then it says in 16, let your light shine before men in such a way that they may see your good works. And notice our purpose here on earth. If you want to know our purpose, it's the same thing that we read in Isaiah 43. But here he says what? That we can glorify our Father who is in heaven. That's why we're here. to have that relationship and glorify. Glorify means extol or praise God here upon the earth. Brandy said this morning in our class that it's like we're walking out and people can see you. In other words, they can see Christ in you. This is not something that we go out and we profess to be Christians and say, look what I do, look what I do, look what I do. It's a glorification of God by how we act, what we say, what we do, what people see in us. It's not like, look who I am. It's not like I visited Chuck the other night. It's not like I gave a Bible to somebody. It's not like we have to brag about everything we do because we're not extolling ourselves. What it is we're glorifying, praising God through our actions, and people can see what we do. Rich people don't have to tell people they're rich. A Christian shouldn't have to tell people that they're acting like a Christian, doing what a Christian does, talking like a Christian talks. It ought to be shown in their actions. And that's glorifying God. And that's what he says. And that's what he means here. That light expels throughout all the earth. And that, when you read Revelation 2 and 3 and what we're at, and you look at the churches, there was a problem there. They were no longer the salt of the earth, not only for themselves. Not only there were a light shining in the congregational setting, they were becoming useless. And Christ says, you better repent or else. I want us to look at when I was thinking about this, I thought, let's turn and look. I want to. We're not coming back there. I'm going to spend just a few minutes. I say that, and I know what everybody's thinking, but I'm going to try to spend just a few minutes real quick. I want to start with Exodus, the 12th chapter, and look at something. Moses' life, we know how he was saved and how he was reared in Pharaoh. We know how he had to leave because he had killed an Egyptian, and we know the story about the people that were down in Egypt and how they cried out and how God in a burning bush talked to Moses. We know all that story, and we know about the plagues, and now they're coming out. And now it's going to be a time of Passover, starting here, an observance every year, so they remember the bloodshed and the freedom from bondage. In verse 38, they were leaving of Exodus 12. It says a mixed multitude. I don't know if you've ever noticed this or not, but we usually think of just Israelites leaving. But he says a mixed multitude also went up with them, along with flocks and herds, a very large number of livestock. Well, they had large herds and stuff themselves, but also Pharaoh gave them some. They got some riches from him, and that's one of the ways they were able to build the temple with that. But notice a mixed multitude. If you go back a few chapters back, it talks about some of the servants of Pharaoh being concerned and fearing, having a fear of the Lord who was doing these plagues, beginning to change their hearts and minds. I don't know who all this mixed multitude was, but there were probably others from other nations that had probably filtered in down into Egypt and probably had stayed there, made the roots there, probably some plagues and stuff. But it was some also, besides the Israelites, that came out, which makes it an interesting story when you begin to read all the murmuring. Now, we know that they started murmuring, complaining about Moses when he went down, and so they claimed that their work was much harder because Moses had gone down and gone before Pharaoh and saying, let my people go. But they murmur and murmur and murmur. Then they get to the Red Sea. And remember, Moses has his rod that he uses. And the people look back. And the people that God chose was the promise to Abraham that we read in 12 and then continued on, and also promised to Isaac and Jacob that there'll be a land that'll be theirs, and he'll set up what we know as the Israelite kingdom. But they get to the Red Sea and they see the Egyptians coming. Now, I don't know how I don't know how far away they were. I don't know anything where they're encamped a day or two there, whatever. But they see, and they start murmuring and complaining. I mean, they'd just gone through the 12 plagues. They'd just been saved from their firstborn being killed. And here they are. They've been complaining all along, but they get down there and they said, boy, Moses, wouldn't it have been better if we had just died in Egypt? Why'd you bring us down here so that we'd be slaughtered? Well, they were supposed to be the salt of the earth, the light of the world at that time. And all they did was complain. Oh, they had so many problems. Just a few weeks ago, I talked about count your many blessings. And this kind of goes along with that. They didn't count their blessings about anything except they wanted to go back to Egypt. They had already forgotten just a few days or whatever the time frame was. They'd already forgotten the blessings they had by being saved from the plagues. But God delivered them. They heard their cry. God delivered them. You see, they didn't want to do it God's way. They didn't want to have trust and faith in God. They wanted to do it their way. Or they want to just die. Well, we know the story. The rod in the seas. See there, the Red Sea is parted. They go over to the cross. And here comes the Egyptians. And Moses puts it out again, and the waters come together. Probably by the pressure, I would think, at the beginning of that, probably killed them rather than them drowning, but they were killed and they were drowned, whatever. However, none of them made it across. Boy, they turn around. And what do? Well, you brought us over here. There ain't no water. There ain't no food. Here it is, a wilderness. Moses, it wouldn't have been better if we just died in Egypt than for you to bring us over here so that we could starve and die of thirst. Think about that. Now, I'm sure that it wasn't just the Israelites doing this, but I'm sure that mixed multitude, those that were in it, some of the worldly people probably were thinking this. Some of those servants and stuff that probably left there were probably thinking, I had it pretty good in Pharaoh's house. We had it pretty good in Egypt. At least we had something to eat and drink. At least they weren't killing us like they thought they would be at the Red Sea. Think about that. Hundreds of thousands of people leaving. And then we still had a sign of the clouds and pillar of fire by night that God was still there. Turn to 17th chapter. Start at verse 1. It says, Then all the congregation of the sons of Israel journeyed by stages from the wilderness of Sin, according to the command of the Lord, and encamped at Rephidim, and there was no water for the people to drink. Verse 2 says, Therefore the people quarreled with Moses and said, Give us water that we may drink. And Moses said to them, Why do you quarrel with me? Why do you test the Lord? Interesting question. But the people thirsted for water. That's all they thought about. And they grumbled against Moses and said, Why now have you brought us up from Egypt to kill us and our children and our livestock? And Moses cried out to the Lord in verse 4, saying, Lord, what shall I do with this people? Think about the pressure Moses had on him. The lawgiver. A little more and they'll stone me. And then the Lord said to Moses, Pass before the people and take with you some of the elders of Israel, and take in your hand your staff with which you struck the Nile, and go. 6 says, Behold, I will stand before you there on the rock at Horeb, and you shall strike the rock, and water will come out of it, that the people may drink. And Moses did so in the sight of the elders of Israel. And so Moses glorified the Lord by going to God, by listening to God, and by doing what God said. And when he struck the rock with his rod, water came out. Turn to Numbers 11. We're going to have to go quickly here. Verse 1. Verse 1 says, Now the people became like those who complain of adversity in the hearing of the Lord. In other words, they were complaining in the Lord's presence even. So the Lord could hear them. I mean, it wasn't like they were talking silently. They were just bellowing it out, in other words. And he says, and when the Lord heard it, his anger, notice, was kindled, and the fire of the Lord burned among them to consume some of the outskirts of the camp. It didn't go through the camp. It was on the outskirts. Some died. And the people cried out to Moses. Moses prayed to the Lord, and the fire died out. We had an intercessor, Moses, who cared for the people. And the people cried out to Moses. And Moses said, okay, I'll pray to God. And then he says in verse 4, the rabble, those who were inciting, probably those of the mixed multitude and the Israelites, they began to stir up again. Who were among them had greedy desires, and also the sons of Israel wept again and said, Who will give us meat to eat? We remember the fish which we used to eat free in Egypt, the cucumbers and melons, the leeks and onions. But now our appetite is gone. There is nothing at all but this manna. Nothing at all but this manna. Here we are complaining again. We had all those good things back in Egypt. Even though we were in bondage, which they forgot, we had all those good things. They said and thought. But now we have no appetite. We're sick and tired of this manna. Now, verse 10 says, Now Moses heard the people weeping throughout their families, each man his doorway of his tent, and the anger of the Lord was kindled greatly, and Moses was displeased. So Moses said to the Lord, Why have you been so hard on your servant? And why have I not found favor in your sight, that you have laid the burden of all this people on me? How do you think? We always think of Moses. Look at stay there, but the very next chapter, chapter 12 of Numbers, look at verse 3. This is interesting. When it says, now the man Moses was very humble, more than any man who was on the face of the earth. Think about that. More humble. He was the meekest man on the earth. And here is the meekest man on the earth, the leader of the people, that goes to God and said, Lord, what is your problem? Look at me. Oh, poor me. How many times do we say, oh, poor me in life? Oh, poor me. And why haven't I found favor? Why have you laid the burden of all these people on my shoulders, Lord? Notice 12, how he puts it. Was it I who conceived all these people? Was it I who brought them forth? That you should say to me, carry them in your bosom as a nurse carries a nursing infant to the land which you swore to your fathers. Is that not interesting? He said, God, it's your people. It's not mine. You gave birth to this nation, not me. You brought them forth, not me. You got them to here, not me. They're complaining because they've lost their appetite. Of course, they've been complaining ever since they left Egypt. So why are you doing it to me? Why don't you take care of it yourself? He says, where am I to get all the meat to give to all this people? Isn't that an interesting question? Moses, who went down to Egypt and was responsible for God through Moses to have all these miracles happen, to use his rod for the waters to divide, use his rod for water to come out, now says, Lord, you expect me to get all this meat for these people? Lord, what's your problem? Think about that. I alone, notice, here's our problem, folks. When we lose our salt, when we no longer are the light of the world, we begin to say, I. Moses and Aaron, God had been with them. There is no question. And now he's here and the people are murmuring. He feels all this pressure and he becomes discouraged, which we all become discouraged at times. But the problem is we've lost our trust, our faith, our belief. When we don't glorify God and he's not glorifying God, he doesn't say, God, what are we going to do about this? He says, Lord, I am alone. We're not alone. And wherever you are, you need to understand that God's with you unless you're doing something that God doesn't approve of. And he's not going to be with you then. He's not going to approve of it then. But we have the blood of Jesus Christ to take care of that situation if we want to take it care of. Moses was to be the salt to show the other people who were to become salt and to be a light to show the other people. But he calls to God and says, I am alone. And I am not able to carry all of this. So you need to deal with it. And if you expect me to do it, just kill me right here. Next verse. And yet, the very next chapter, we see Moses being a humble man. I don't know how he took what he took. Let's look look at 21 of the same chapter. I'm going to have to quit. I got some other, but I'm going to quit. I'm not going to keep it like I did last time. 21 of this chapter, it says, but Moses said, oh, wait, I like this. Let me go down. Let's start with 18. He says, say this to the people, Moses, concentrate yourselves for tomorrow and you shall eat meat. For you have wept in the ears of the Lord, saying, oh, that someone would give us meat to eat, for we were well off in Egypt. He's now telling Moses, tell the people, here's what you're saying. Okay, I hear what you're saying, and you think you're better off in Egypt. Okay. Therefore, the Lord will give you meat, and you shall eat not 1 day, verse 19, nor 2 days, nor 5 days, nor 10 days, nor 20 days, but a whole month until, notice, it comes out of your nostrils and becomes loathsome to you, because you have rejected the Lord who is among you, and have wept before him, saying, why did we ever leave Egypt? But Moses said in 21, the people among who I am are 600,000 on foot. Yet you have said, I will give them meat so that they may eat for a whole month. Look, Moses is still got a problem here. Should flocks and herds be slaughtered for them to be sufficient for them? Question, or should all the fish of the sea be gathered together for them to be sufficient for them? In other words, he's saying, to give them all meat for a whole month, there's not enough fish in the sea. There's not enough herds on this land to do that. Moses is saying to God. Can you imagine? And so the Lord says, is the Lord's power limited? Question. I'm sure God looks down at us many times in our lives and would like to ask us point blank, do you think my power is limited? Do you think I don't know what you need? Do you think I don't know what shape you're in? Do you not know that the person that you can look at has the same problems that you do? Have you ever wondered why there are those that live in the same house, brought up by the same parents? Some become something and some do not. Some may be Christians and some may not. We all serve the same God. I think it may be the heart. And he says, is the Lord's power limited? Now you shall see whether my word will come true for you or not. Well, Moses is rebuked as we go further on. We don't have time, and I'm not going to. We all know the story. He wasn't able to go into the promised land. Let me ask you a question. And I'm going to finish with this. How would you answer this? Today, is there too much world in the church? Or is there not enough church in the world? How would you answer that? Is there too much church in the world? Or is there not enough church? I mean, is there too much world in the church, or is there not enough church in the world? Think about that. If you have need to answer the call, don't you know? Lord of the Lord.